this is the point on the program where some of us who worked to bring this conference together get to speak a little bit about our plans for the future, and also perhaps a little bit about some of the things that we've learned. I think the most important thing is that we tried to bring together the scholars and the experts who worked on three distinct cases in a forum that would allow the experts to hear each other and to learn from each other, at the same time that we observed them learning from each other and had a chance to interrogate them. And this is really only the start of the process. The ultimate goal is to produce a book arising from these exchanges and to distill in that process, probably in the conclusion of that book, some of the thematic convergences that not only Armenians, Jews, and First Nations can learn from, but that many other peoples confronted by crimes against humanity and genocide can learn from. And a parallel goal is to help us to understand that, just as several of our presenters pointed out, the beginning of the process of othering or excluding whole groups of human beings from the rest of humanity, what sociologists like Jörg Simmel and others called, Helen Fine, the universe of human obligation. The beginning of that process is often the assault on their culture, the crime, which is still not in the criminal codes of many countries, but is contained within the Rome Treaty and Rome Statute definition of crimes against humanity, of attempting to destroy a culture that is ethnocide, that is an early warning signal of even worse to come. It may take the form initially of ethnic cleansing, which is a terrible word because, as Greg Stanton and others have pointed out, the implication is that the people who are being essentially deported from their homes are polluting and contaminating the place where they live. So ethnic cleansing is removing them and cleansing the area. But that was often the term used by the perpetrators. That ethnic cleansing, which then often involves terror against those groups, but also the assault on their culture in order to persuade their neighbors not to defend them or help them by demonizing them as agents of Satan and representatives that claims that they represent all that is evil, requires our attention. One of the great dilemmas we have in contemplating more effective ways to prevent genocide is that some of the early warning signals do not involve the murder of hundreds of thousands of people at all. They start with the killing of a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen. And that is so common in the world we live in that our detectors are often flooded by those blips on our radar screens. And so we pay too little attention to them, largely because we're not willing to do the hard work of disaggregating them to see which of them actually possess the potential to become much more significant with respect to either numbers or spell the fate of a very small group, say an indigenous Aboriginal group, for example, which today could represent only 85 or 100 people, the last remnants of an entire language group, for example. So from the point of view of genocide prevention, the work that's been presented here is significant in its own right. But in addition, we're trying to understand how all of this impacts on those of us who are privileged and live in parts of the world where we are not imminently threatened by crimes against humanity. And I think back to Morley Safer's comment to Hannah Gartner, in which, and also in his talk, in which he said, you know, all I'm really asking, I don't expect much, is that museums will document in the presentation of their stolen art the provenance of that art. And just be upfront and tell us, you know, this canvas belonged to this Jewish family in Vienna, for example, and it was sold under forced bargain rate conditions to a Nazi official or seized by the state, etc. And we got it after it passed through these hands, and so that's the provenance of which you're looking at. I think that those of you who've stayed with us since Wednesday night or started with us this morning also recognize the very rich themes and the convergence of those themes in several of the panels, which I hope we can bring together in the contributions of the presenters here in the book or in a special issue of a journal in the next 18 months. Because we heard some very important observations, sometimes in the papers, sometimes in the discussion that followed the presentations, including not only the parallels, but also the very important contrasts among the, or between the cases. And those contrasts are very fertile and a very fruitful area for further research. And I think we have to say that in the book and in the common parts of our discussion in the book. And that would include the significance of the fact that the Nazis were seeking to annihilate the Jewish people, ultimately began by, as Robert Jahn put it so well and so profoundly, excluding them from the German nation, stripping them of their citizenship, creating the category of subject in which they had no rights but only responsibilities, and barred them from ownership and sale of, quote, German art as opposed to degenerate art which they wished to hide or destroy or sell overseas. Whereas in other cases that we've been hearing about, we'll take some of the First Nations cases, the notion was that they would be assimilated, that the members of the First Nations would be assimilated, and their art was valuable in the United States market, as some of our presenters pointed out. And indeed, some of the native peoples were producing products in order just to survive for sale in the United States. Well, this is a very different situation. It's a very interesting situation. It says that the attitude of the dominant missionary groups, the dominant provincial governments, the federal government towards the native people was, well, if you're not going to vanish, then we will assimilate you. It's the opposite of excluding people from, let's say, the Canadian nation, but only on our terms, which is that you be like us. You cannot still have your dances. You cannot have your artwork. You cannot put up your totem poles, etc. So the different focal points of the assault on people bears with it, I think, a whole host of lessons that we can learn from. I don't know that what we've been hearing makes us very optimistic about the human condition. I'm sure that many of you feel, as I do, that human beings have to work really hard to become what we call human. That the ideal that we all have in our minds of what it means to be really human is an ideal that we are far from attaining. So I want to conclude by asking you to join me in resolving that you will do everything you can coming out of this conference to work towards that goal, informed by the insights of our presenters here. That you will look with a critical and, perhaps I should say, more sensitive eye at what's on the wall in the next museum you visit, that you will think about the dilemmas confronting and the challenges confronting us about the kind of native art exhibits that museums mount, that you will consider the immense, frustrating challenges confronting the Armenian people, who not only have to deal with the burden of their losses, but also the ultimate insult, the claim that what happened to them didn't happen to them. A huge burden to carry, together with everything else. And finally, perhaps we can take heart a little bit from the changes between 1946 and 2013 in the jurisprudence and the popular attitude towards the theft of art in the hands of Jewish collectors, and think seriously about the fact that some progress has been made, some measure of justice, a very, very tiny sliver of justice, has been achieved already, and perhaps this little ray of light in the darkness can be expanded through your efforts and that of the people you influence to turn this into the light of 1,000 suns, not the light of a nuclear explosion. In the book that has that title, Brighter Than 1,000 Suns, but brighter than 1,000 suns in making us more human and more enlightened. Thank you very much.